Beatrice, that's me. It's Maia Rossi. Sami already introduced me, so no need to say much more. Climate Horizon is the company I founded, and we specialize in transition and just transition and climate change strategy. So for this session today, I'm going to present to you a study we recently made last year for the Loudest Foundation, Fall Foundation, and the Wallace Global Fund. And please, Beatrice, let's play the video, and I'll see you for a chat afterwards.
Our economy is changing to meet climate goals and keep up with new technologies. This means phasing out high carbon emitting industries while introducing and scaling up greener alternatives. As we transition at speed, industries must also focus on creating good jobs, not low-wage or insecure ones, upgrading people's skills, not leaving them unprepared, and helping vulnerable communities thrive for generations to come. Governments, companies, investors, workers, and societies at large are already planning for this greener and fairer future, but some groups have more power than others to influence how industries transform. The term just transition has emerged to describe the complex challenges and risks different groups face during this shift, particularly workers, affected communities, and low and middle income countries. So what exactly is a just transition, and how do we accelerate it? A recent study commissioned by the Loudest Foundation, Ford Foundation, and Wallace Global Fund delved into these questions. The mapping examined over 600 just transition initiatives spanning 4 global regions: Africa, Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, and 5 industries: energy, critical minerals, fashion, finance, and the built environment. The goal was to inform funding, collaboration, and further research by philanthropic organizations. As it turns out, the meaning of just transition depends on whom you ask. Even though the interpretation of just transition varies according to context, there is broad agreement on its principles. A just transition should foster inclusion, build agency, and establish accountability for those affected by changing industries. Fostering inclusion means ensuring workers and communities vulnerable to climate change and industrial transformation have a voice in decisions that affect them. Building agency means workers and communities are able to put forward their own priorities and solutions. And establishing accountability means decision makers within companies and governments take responsibility for making the industrial transformation inclusive. Affected communities should be able to hold them accountable for delivering a just transition. Philanthropic funding can play a vital role in accelerating a just transition across industries. Here are 3 actions to consider. First, we must act much faster to deliver industrial transformation that meets climate goals while creating good jobs and improving people's lives. We can start by working together to break down the silos between climate-focused efforts and social equality-focused efforts, recognizing that these issues are intertwined and must be aligned. Second, funders have the opportunity to invest in building the agency of vulnerable workers and communities so that they can work alongside companies and governments in planning and delivering just transitions. Finally, funders can support efforts to encourage governments and companies to collaborate with workers and local communities when implementing climate action that transforms industries. The industrial transformation is well underway, but how can we accelerate the process to achieve a just transition? What conversations need to happen to ensure this change is equitable for all? To learn more about how we can support a fair, green, and inclusive economy, read the Just Transitions Initiatives mapping at www.loudestfoundation.org.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. So I would like to start with a question to the audience. Have you encountered the term just transition in your work recently? If so, what does just transition mean in your context? And I'll leave up the code so you can scan it and we can read your answer. And the reason why we're asking is because when we were instructed to go and look for the initiative on just transition, really what we found is that there was no universal definition of a just transition. We do have many different definitions. The first one, or the most recognized one, the one from the ILO, that was made in 2021 with a focus on workers. But really the terms, there is no, as per today, there is no agreement exactly on what just transition is. So that was the first challenge we really encountered when started the mapping. So, okay, so I can see that 6 of you already encountered the term just transition. I'll be curious to know in which context, and I will be reading the answer later on. So what we found out when we started to map the initiative out there is that the global definition was not there, but we could have some characteristic, no, to be in order to recognize an initiative as part of the just transition. So the first one is that it needed to have the 2 sustainable dimension of environmental and social topics, sustainable development, people and planet, whatever you want to call them. So the 2 elements of the E and the S. Then we also found these 3 key concepts that we are going to talk more about later, of inclusion, agency, and accountability. And then we found out that actually in the 2 dimension of social and environment, building inclusion, agency, and accountability, it still really changes depending on the sector and the geography. So we were set up to find a just transition initiative across 5 geography. I think is the next slide that really shows the span of it here. So we had Europe, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, and global outlook. And then we also had 5 different sectors. So we have critical minerals, energy, fashion, finance, and built environment. So, and what we found out is that really the definition of just transition changes depending on to whom you ask. So we set up to do a stakeholder engagement, and we interview 50 or more stakeholders from the academia to the private sector, to the government, to the civil society. We really, with a wide spectrum. And we found a different focus that could have been a narrow or a broader focus across the different characteristics of the just transition. So for example, there could be a focus on, specifically a narrow focus on workers when it comes to vulnerable groups, or it could have been a broader focus to include all sorts of vulnerable group communities and governments. And then when we were talking about environmental dimension, we could have a very narrow focus on climate mitigation, climate adaptation, or a broader focus on ecosystem and water and nature. And so on. So really the spectrum of the just transition definition is wide and change across sector and geography. So I'm just reading your answer now. Energy transition away from carbon intensive industry and towards low carbon ones. That's a very good concept. We did found this and we name it, and I'm going to tell you how the stakeholder named it. Ensure climate action takes into consideration also the social side. Yes, that was the basis. So the basis of the just transition was really considering the environmental and the social dimension. It's a confusing term that got everyone asking what it means. Okay, we got a team of 20 experts looking at it, so I couldn't agree more. Focus on workers and communities. Yes, one of the focus is worker and communities, together with the environmental focus of climate and ecosystem. Equitable transformation to a more sustainable world that doesn't leave anyone behind. That's an amazing definition. I think that was also used for the UN SDGs. And I recently read an article, I think it was from The Guardian, saying that just transition is a transition, is the child of energy transition and the SDGs. Okay, so thank you for your answer. And let's move into the results of the mapping. So as you can see here, we found about 632 initiatives. So the mapping only lasted 3 months. Otherwise, I'm sure we could have found more. And also we took the face value. So the initiative, the project needed to refer to themselves as just transition project and initiatives. So it could be that some initiatives that have the same characteristic, but have not been calling themselves as part of the just transition umbrella, have not been mapped, even if our team kind of went into that. And what I highlighted this mapping is really the diversity of initiative that we found. But let's move into another question. Which sectors? So the sector were critical mineral, energy, fashion, built environment, and finance. In which sector do you think we found the highest number of just transition initiatives? The sector were given to us by Laudes. They were interested in the result in this sector. We also wanted to consider food and the supply chain of food, but there was no time. So for the moment, we focused the study on these 5 sectors. And while you reply, we're going to show you the results. So the result divided by sector and geography. As you can see, renewable energy, fossil fuels, and critical minerals really make the bulk of it. And the reason is that the transition really started as an energy transition. So the first sector that were interested and proactively looking into transition were the energy, classic energy ones. As you can see, financial, built environment, and fashion follow really with more than half of the initiatives. So they're way behind when it comes to industrial transition and industrial transformation. Other key takeaways from the study were that the mapping really results highlight that a one-size-fits-all approach to just transition cannot work at this stage because of the different meaning of just transition across industries and geography. And then also the need of breaking silos, and we're going to see what does this mean. So these were the results. I wonder if someone was fast enough to got the answer, so we can then move. Oh yeah, renewable energy, built environment. No, so okay, most of you did reply energy. Built environment, funnily enough, it was probably the least together with fashion. Yeah, which was a surprise. Built environment, we did expect not to find much because real estate, in general, cement, we did expect not to find much. But fashion, we thought we could find more, but we didn't actually. So fashion is still very behind in the just transition. Okay, so let's move into the next. Okay, so who said before, some of you said energy transition away from carbon intensive industry and towards low carbon one. Yes. So when we set up to talk with the stakeholders, we went with a set of questions and we asked them to define the just transition and how to accelerate the just transition, etc. What they really came back to us was there could not be any transition, and let alone a just transition, if we don't consider these 2 key dynamic. And these 2 key dynamic, one is the old and dear power dynamic, which is the power dynamic between the global north and the global south, the power dynamic interplaying into the supply chain, the power dynamic between decision makers and decision takers, you know, the kind of the unequal link to the unequal distribution of influence and resources. And the other dynamic was, it's a very different situation if we talk about the transitioning out or the transitioning in. So it's a different scenario when we talk about transitioning out of high carbon emission industry and transitioning in lower carbon emission industry. And here, these 2 dynamics, the power dynamic and transitioning in and out, really played a big role in shaping our understanding and then the strategy for this philanthropic organization. And this research introduced the concept of agency, accountability, and inclusion. So what does this mean? It means that, yes, just transition means taking into consideration the environmental element, the climate, water, and nature element, and the social element, but it also needs to be done in a way that really drive inclusion, agency, and accountability because of the layers of the industrial transformation, because of where the industrial transformation sits on. So you have, while designing a just transition initiative, you have to include the communities, the most vulnerable and marginalized community, and the workers, that anyone that is actually going to be impacted by this transition, or maybe excluded also by this transition. Then once you have included them to the table, you have to listen to what they're putting forward as solution for the mid and long term. So really give them agency of shaping the future. And then you have to keep accountable governments and companies, you know, onto their responsibility. And once they have included the communities and the worker, listen, and together came out with solution, then we have to stick to this solution and stick to this plan. Here on the right, you can see we also try to see which initiative in the just transition had an element, and we find that all of them, they did have an element of inclusion, agency, and accountability. So kind of this two aspects, one of the two-dimensional environmental and social, and the other of inclusion, agency, accountability, brought together, really was shaping what a just transition initiative could look like. And then if we move, so what were the main findings apart from this one? First of all, as we said, breaking silence, climate action and human rights at the same time, which seems very easy to do, but it can sound very overwhelming. And also, I've recently been at talk in London. We were at the Trust Conference, and there was some representative of big corporates. And somehow the private sector is also asking, okay, where do we start? We have a department that is looking to the decarbonization plan, a department that is looking to the human rights. So the first action would really be to let these two departments talk to each other and look at what are the consequences and the action of one's plan. So you, for example, you do have a transition plan, you do have a climate change strategy and a transition plan. What does this mean for your supply chain? What does this mean for your human rights or social or labor department? So including the two plans really in one holistic plan, and looking at the ripple effect one on the another. What is your decarbonization strategy going to dictate to your operation strategy? That's really a starting point. So when we talk with our client, our organization, when there is a feeling of overwhelming, really the starting point can be to try to break this silence. And also within the climate, for example, the breaking silo can still need to happen, right? Because the climate is not something that happens in a void. The climate happens within an ecosystem. It happens within a natural ecosystem. So also the feature of water and biodiversity needs to be considered. So anything that really helps breaking silos between the E, inside the E, and between the E and the S. This is really where the plans should focus. Then there is no one-size-fits-all approach. As we said, approaches need to be context-specific, culturally relevant. For example, in Latin America, we found that just transition wasn't really used as a term, and the term that was used was climate justice. And everything that the dimension of just transition was really linked to the land defenders and to the rights of indigenous people, because for Latin America, this is where the transition is playing out the most. For Africa, was really about critical minerals, and we did a little example we can talk about, and the role of Africa in the critical mineral supply chain. For Europe was really about the labor and labor rights and upskilling, reskilling of workers, and also government and politics. While at the global level, It depended if it was a global level with a focus on North America or a global level with a focus on policy in other part of the world. But overall, there was a big attention to KPIs. What are the metrics for measuring a just transition? What are the policies and the frameworks? And here, one findings, for example, that we had that most of the stakeholders were trying to ask not for another framework, but for merging some framework. For example, the task force could be merged, and instead of having and also having a narrow scope on the climate change and nature and social, having a wider umbrella on the just transition. And then, as we were saying, consider inclusion, agency, and accountability, and the power imbalance during industry transition. Again, the transition is not happening in a void, so it does need to take into consideration the power imbalance that already are present in the economies. And if we move here, there are some more detail on why breaking silos really is the key between climate change and human rights. They are interconnected challenge. It does need to build resilience and protect the vulnerable community. I'm sure that the audience does know, so we can go a little bit faster and maybe focus on green extractivism. So that's really this is really something that came out with the stakeholder, especially in Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America, not so much in Europe, obviously, as a form of new exploitation, really. So one of the solutions we're going to see in a second in the recommendation was, for example, to try to build some of the end of the supply chain within the global south geography. So, for example, technology, the kind of the final stage of technology, not only focusing in the manufacturing of it in Europe, but kind of moving them in Africa and Southeast Asia. So before we kind of dive into the recommendation our team of experts has found during this mapping, what recommendation would you make to help drive the just transition in the geographical, sectoral, and business context you operate? And by business context here, we mean, is it the private sector? Is it the civil society? Is it the philanthropic? Because it also depends. This specific research and this specific mapping was done to find the acupressure point. They call it acupressure point. So the important point for philanthropy in how to design their own strategy of funding. So there are some answers coming on. Allocate financial resources to the work required to engage communities and workers affected by the transition. Surely alignment. So one of the findings was really funding the unfundable, the stakeholders call it. So funding the alignments, funding the engagement, funding the awareness, the round table between civil society and business and between union and business. Have companies contributed to a pooled fund just focused on engaging with communities? There's research already done in the mechanism of such a fund. Oh, okay, that would be interesting to know more. So the challenge we found when we talk with the private sector, apart from the business case that, you know, the private sector for the business case, so the business case for climate and transition is there. The business case for human rights is more difficult. Is more difficult. So when we talk about just transition, I found quite successful when we talk about the transition plan and to look at the lens of risk and opportunities, also not only with climate, but also with the social components. So like the upskilling, reskilling of the workers or the communities. When it comes to funds, that's more a government kind of mechanism. Private companies are still, they're still familiarizing themselves, I think, with the sector and with the term. So let's move to some of the recommendations that we found out. So we divided them by inclusion, agency, and accountabilities. For inclusion, really ensure traditional communities are involved in project through impact assessment, That's also typical of development banks, kind of bring this development into also climate action, this kind of development focus on the traditional communities into climate action and transition plan, engage worker in transition plan, so the people that are going to be affected by it, collaborate with policymaker and legal expert to establish formal framework. This is what we were talking about it. What is going to be the formal frameworks for companies and government? Establish climate targets and transition strategy and plans and create decent work. So again, having a transition plan is a good starting point. Adding the lens of the just transition plan and looking at your own, if you're an organization, looking at your own risks and opportunities. And then still on inclusion, invest in sector-specific initiative and awareness raising campaign. So a campaign, again, alignment. Strengthen protection and integration of rights into policy and management, and that's already present in some of the CSRD, CSDD legislation in Europe. Use funding to strengthen multi-stakeholder initiative, as you were saying in your answer. There's a new one from the audience. Context, private sector philanthropy. In energy training and energy transition recommendation, better bottom up. Yeah. For sure, bottom up is key. More flexible funding models to fund a wider range of activities. Yes, you nailed it. Another finding that we had, it was about the flexible funding. So longer period of funding, funding without a precise scope. For example, that was really the organization, the civil society organization asked for. We want funding to look into the just transition and understand and study it a little bit more before we put forward an initiative. So this flexible funding for sure is also something we found out. And then if we move into agency, the recommendation around agency, one big point was about doing plans that are actually realistic and strategies that companies and government can implement. So without going from 10 to 100, but looking at what's already in there and adding as a module, adding brick by brick, aligning with unions to develop and implement appropriate social protection for workers and affected communities. So legislation, really. Here again on the standards, the integration of it, cooperation of all stakeholders, roundtables, bring just transition to COP. I think many would expect this year the just transition to become a key words in Baku for COP29. And then accountability, and here we did a little bit a case of Europe. And if you go into the next slides, Bea, really on the supply chain. So nurture the collection, development, decision-making evidence, supporting research, establish coordination and shared narratives, leverage existing sustainability frameworks, integrate indicator, and implement pilot programs to apply develop metrics within selected industry and regions. So collecting data that can then drive policy and framework. One interesting thing, one of the interesting quotes that stays with me really when we did a stakeholder engagement was from an African stakeholder, and they said, we are not interested to going to be poor into a higher emitting carbon economy, to going to be poor into a lower emitting carbon economy. So really creating value during the transformation, or some of the governments of the Global South won't follow the transformation. So a social license to operate also. Similar to the one that the mining kind of had. Here we prepared just a couple of slides on the critical minerals. So critical minerals are increasingly important in new energy value chains, especially Latin America and Africa. And the demand for critical mineral is largely stemmed from policy in the global north, right? Another quote from one of the stakeholders was, we are substituting the fossil fuel oil with capital. So the transformation is going to be capital intensive. So many governments and many states that are low and middle income will be left behind if we don't use a special just transition strategy. So a feasible solution involves shifting technology production to the global south. For example, there's plenty of fossil fuel industry that could upskill and reskill into more kind of refining of mining product. That was one of the solutions put forward. Targeted industrialization policies to support this transition. And then obviously, and this was especially in Latin America, the zone of environmental sacrifice highlights the challenges faced by marginalized community near polluting industries and extractive areas. So engage with this voice to avoid green extractivism. Here we just put some example because 30% of the Just Transition Initiative in Latin America, for example, were related to critical mineral. I think the percentage is the double in Africa. And here there are a couple of examples of some initiative that we found. We also found one in Southeast Asia. I think is in the next slide. Yeah, is by the Indian government on the Think 20. So yeah, that's kind of the focus. If you are interested in knowing more, you can look. I think the AlterCOP will be giving you the deck. It can be distributed with all the links. And then if we move, I think we are at the end of the presentation. I wanted to give a little bit of time, so sorry, I arrived a little bit short of breath. So here you can find my profile on LinkedIn, our company, the animated video show at the beginning, and the summary and the full report with the full list of initiatives we map in Annex 2 at Laude's website. And yeah.